Hey and welcome to Neverwinter with Aragon. So it's been well confirmed by now that the Band of Air is indeed getting a nerf, this controversial, infamous ring. In much content, it has led to nearly a 20% damage increase on many of the classes, specifically a rogue and a warlock. Aside from that, the wizard has also lent heavily on the ring for its damage output. So, with it inevitably getting a nerf, what are we going to be using instead of it? So I've put together a bunch of these rings to show which rings would you be using if this Band of Air all of a sudden becomes next to useless. And ultimately, how much damage does the Band of Air have to deal in order for it to still remain best in slot? As that is what they stated as their intent. I'm not exactly sure how they're going to do it, but right now, if they wanted to do that, they would have to look at every single class and balance it individually, and really, I don't see them doing that, which is going to mean, ultimately, we're still going to end up in a pretty big mess with regards to class balance. Some classes will still be able to use the Band of Air to obtain a lot more damage than other classes, but it will really depend how much overall damage the Band of Air will actually benefit you. So let's go over this and all the other options that you might be using, so you might want to make sure you've got those rings ready to go once the nerf comes out. Before we get started, I'd like to give a massive thank you to all of these channel members for the continued support. Now the first thing we want to do is compare the amount of damage, the effective damage we would obtain through switching out our Band of Air to some other competitive ring. Right now, the Band of Air is just insane, granting up to, on a rogue, like nearly 20% of our overall damage. However, we already know this is getting nerfed by changing it so it doesn't proc off other certain gear and potentially changing it so it doesn't proc off certain class powers. So as an example, let's say we took this Queen's Opal ring instead of the Band of Air. How much damage would the Band of Air have to deal in order to beat this 3% extra damage gain we gain from the ring? Before we go into that, I actually want to show you a bug which is actually not just visual. You can see right now we only have one ring and we have only one gear piece that is giving us this swordsman's perk. And you can see in top left there, we actually have two swordsman perks. And this is due to some bug when you stay in an instance for an extended period of time. You'll end up with two of these. Now I've actually tested this out on a dummy and found that it does indeed give us 6% additional damage, not just 3%. So that could definitely be an option to exploit this and then use it instead of the Band of Air. As all other damaging ring options, for example, our Mighty Breaker's Ring of Clarity only gives us 3%. However, keep in mind that's 3% to everything, not just, let's say, melee powers. And then you have your Way Watcher's Ring with 4% additional damage if you stand further than 50 feet or more from your target. Then you have, much like the melee damage ring, you have the ranged damage ring with that sniper's perk. And of course then you have like your Red Eyes Glare or your Soothsayer's Ring of Absolution, just giving stats there of 7.5% or 7%. And with upcoming Dragonflight, you'll be able to obtain this ring here, the Saboteur's Dragonflight ring, with up to 5% accuracy. So in order to compare these rings, we need to look at a little bit of math. For example, comparing a 3% damage ring versus the Band of Air, this would be 3% that adds to all our damage. The Band of Air would have to deal more than 2% of our damage. And you can see that goes from our damage buffs of 50% to 53%. And that is because looking at this here, we're gaining about 50% damage. And across the classes, you might have more or less. And on a rogue, I can definitely stack a few more damage sources. But I just wanted to give this a generous estimate so that when we do compare this 3%, it might look like it's a little bit more beneficial on your overall damage. It could definitely be lower the higher your damage buffs are. And you look at 4% and that's 2.67. You look at 6%, that's 4%. The Band of Air would have to deal that much damage or more in order for it to be competitive. And then you have the 7% stat ring. The Band of Air only has to deal 2.9% more damage to be competitive. and then the 7.5, that's 3.11%, and then a 10% damage ring, the Band of Air would have to deal more than 6.67%. But realistically, there's never going to be any scenario where you'd be running with two 10% damage rings, other than, let's say, Crown of Keldagon, where the dragon is both undead and dragon, and then you could definitely get away with running both those 10% damage rings. Unless, of course, the Band of Air still deals more than 6.67% of your overall damage. So ultimately, the Band of Air has to compete with the 7.5% stat ring, meaning it has to deal over 3.11% of your overall damage in order for the Band of Air to still be best in slot. You'd want to give it a generous bit of room, so I would say at least 4% of your overall damage or more, otherwise you could just get away with running stats and not have much of a damage difference at all. So that's the lowest of the low that they could nerf the Band of Air to. It would be very sad, in my opinion, for the Band of Air to get reduced lower than 10%, as the grind to get this ring is just insane and unlike any other in the entire game, and as such it should be rewarded for people to be going through that grind, and then they finally get their reward and they should be able to make full use of it. People might throw the argument, well, you just had nearly over a year to make full use of this Band of Air, be happy. But no, I'm not going to be happy when it gets nerfed to the ground and other rings become better to use in its stead, because the amount of time it took me half a year to get the Band of Air, I've only had it since just before Christmas. And many other players are in my same shoes, let alone players are still out there grinding for it. I personally wouldn't grind for it now. I'd wait for them to reduce the drop rates, but at the same time, then it will become nerfed. And then you might not even want to have bothered gone through the grind, or even bother go through the grind, because all it's going to benefit you is maybe 1 or 2% extra damage. Anyway, to conclude, ultimately the Band of Air just has to compete with 3% extra damage you gain from just having a stat ring. Doesn't have to compete with the 10% damage bonus rings in specific content, since you generally can only run one of those rings. However, last thing to mention is when the Band of Air gets nerfed, it might no longer be viable to run, for example, the Mythallar set, as we are purely running that to proc the Band of Air. Many classes might want to switch to an alternative like the Demogorgon set with Demogorgon's Wrath bonus of 5% additional damage, along with an additional hit if you crit 5 times in a row. Ultimately, when we test that out, I found that for a magic wielder who's not going to gain any benefit from the Demogorgon set, where it would give you 6 strength, the Mythallar set only has to deal over 3.33% damage. That is excluding the additional hit from Demo, which could be upwards of 1%, ultimately that being 4.33% that the Mythallar would have to deal on your class in order for Mythallars to still be best. Looking, let's say, on a Warlock here, we can see we have our raw pressure, and that was 4% of his overall damage. So that means it's very close to what you would get with your Demogorgon set with its additional hit. But switching over to a Rogue, we can see that raw pressure again was actually 6% of our overall damage. However, it's a little bit different because you gain ability scores, which is strength, which increases this strength and intelligence to 8.3%. So the Mythallar would have to deal more than 4.78%, excluding the Demogorgon's additional hit. So this would be about nearly 6% damage you would obtain from the Demogorgon set versus Mythallar. But with Mythallar being able to deal sometimes up to 6% of our damage, they're just so close that I personally wouldn't go and invest in the Demogorgon set. I will have to be corrected if I'm wrong later down the line, as we can also see the item level difference is a little bit different as well. Overall, the difference between Demogorgon and also Mythallar is so small that the majority of you don't even have to worry about it. I will continue testing, and once the time of the actual Band of Air nerf happens, then we'll be running content and I'll be able to directly compare in the current endgame content at the time, whether that be the new reworked Neverwinter trial or still Tiamat or even some other new dungeon. We're gonna have to see. Overall, hopefully this has been somewhat insightful to you guys as to how much the Band of Air can get nerfed down to for it to still be best in slot. Again, it just has to compete with the stats you would gain from one of these rings, as that's effectively the most amount of damage you're getting, 3.11%. If the Band of Air can deal 4% damage, then that makes it effectively best in slot. Personal hopes are that it will still remain about 10% of our average damage, but I could just be dreaming. So again, I'd like to give a special thank you to all of these channel members for helping me keep my channel going. And if I presented this well, consider leaving the video a like. And if you're new around here, consider subscribing. We'll see you guys around. Goodbye for now.